For 70 years, one of the most famous experiments in the history of science convinced the entire world of something that turned out to be completely wrong. A man built a raft, floated it across the Pacific, and proved a theory that textbooks repeated for generations. Then, geneticists opened up the DNA of the people he claimed to explain and found the opposite story hiding inside their bones. The man's name was Thor Heyerdahl, and in 1947 he did something almost nobody thought was possible. He built a raft out of balsa logs, tied it together with hemp rope, refused to use a single piece of modern metal in its construction, and pushed off from the coast of Peru with 5 companions and a parrot. He called it the Kon-Tiki. For 101 days, that raft drifted across more than 4,000 miles of open Pacific Ocean at the mercy of currents and wind until it finally crashed into a reef near the Tuamotu Islands in French Polynesia. Heyerdahl and his crew survived, and the moment they stepped onto that beach, they believed they had proven something enormous. They believed they had proven that the people of Polynesia were descended from South Americans, ancient mariners who had sailed west from the coast of Peru long before anyone else dared to cross that ocean. It is hard to overstate how big this idea became. Heyerdahl wrote a book about the voyage that sold more than 50 million copies. He made a documentary film about it that won an Academy Award. For an entire generation, the Kon-Tiki expedition was one of the defining scientific adventure stories of the 20th century, taught in schools, discussed in living rooms, referenced in encyclopedias as though it had settled a question that archaeologists and anthropologists had been arguing about for decades. The logic seemed so clean. If a raft made of nothing but wood and rope could survive that crossing, then surely ancient people, without engines or steel, could have made the same journey. And if they could have made it, then maybe they did. Maybe the descendants of the people building thatched huts and paddling outrigger canoes across the Pacific were not from Asia at all. Maybe their ancestors had come from the Andes. There was just one problem. Heyerdahl had proven that a raft could survive the trip. He had not proven that anyone actually made it, and he certainly had not proven who the ancestors of Polynesians actually were. Feasibility is not evidence. Just because a wooden raft could theoretically drift from Peru to French Polynesia does not mean that the ancestors of the Maori, the Samoans, the Tahitians, the Hawaiians, and the people of Rapa Nui actually came from that direction. For decades, though, nobody had a way to check. There was no tool available in the 1940s or 1950s or even the 1960s that could look inside a living person's cells and read the story of where their ancestors came from. Anthropologists could compare skull shapes, linguists could compare vocabulary and grammar, archaeologists could dig up pottery shards and stone tools, but nobody could open up a strand of DNA and ask it directly, "Where do you come from?" and get a real answer. That changed. And when scientists finally built the tools to ask that question properly, the answer that came back was almost the exact opposite of what Heyerdahl had spent his life trying to prove. The first cracks in the South American theory actually came from language, long before genetics caught up. Linguists who studied the words spoken across the Pacific Islands found something remarkable. The languages of Polynesia, from Hawaiian to Maori to Tahitian to Samoan, were not isolated tongues that had developed independently on scattered islands. They were part of one enormous interconnected language family called Austronesian, a family that stretches all the way back to Taiwan and includes languages spoken in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Madagascar, off the coast of Africa, and across the vast expanse of the Pacific. Words for canoe, for fish, for specific stars used in navigation showed up again and again with only small variations, like dialects of the same ancient root language spreading outward over thousands of years. This was a language tree with its trunk firmly planted in Asia, not South America. If the ancestors of the Polynesians had truly sailed from Peru, their languages should carry some trace of that origin. They carry none. Every linguistic thread runs west, toward Taiwan and Southeast Asia, not east, toward the Andes. Archaeology told a similar story. Digs across the Pacific uncovered a very specific and very recognizable style of pottery, decorated with intricate dentate-stamped patterns, called lapita pottery. Lapita sites appear first in the Bismarck Archipelago near New Guinea, then spread eastward across the Pacific over the following centuries, showing up on island after island in a trail that stretches from Melanesia into the western edges of Polynesia. The dates line up. The pottery styles evolve gradually as you move eastward, showing a population expanding outward step by step. Nothing about lapita pottery, or its distribution, or its dating, points backward toward South America. It points from Asia, through Melanesia, out into the Pacific. So even before DNA sequencing became possible, the linguistic and archaeological evidence had already built a strong case that undercut Heyerdahl's theory. But theories built on wood and rope in one dramatic voyage are hard to kill in the public imagination, especially when the man behind them was a brilliant showman as much as a scientist. It took genetics to finally settle the argument, and even then, the story that emerged was far stranger and more interesting than either side of the old debate had imagined. The first wave of genetic studies using mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down only through mothers, and looking at markers in blood samples collected from living Polynesians, pointed firmly toward Asia. A specific genetic marker, known as the Polynesian motif, a small mutation carried in the mitochondrial DNA of Pacific Islanders, was traced back through Southeast Asia and into Taiwan, matching the same trail the Austronesian languages had already mapped out. This was the maternal line, the story told by mothers passing DNA to their children across dozens of generations, and it said clearly that the deep roots of Polynesian ancestry sat in Asia, not the Americas. But then something curious showed up when scientists looked at the other half of the story, the DNA passed down specifically through fathers, found on the Y chromosome. The paternal lineages of many Polynesian men did not match the same clean Asian signal seen in the mitochondrial DNA. Instead, they showed a much stronger connection to Melanesia, the region encompassing Papua, New Guinea, and the surrounding islands. This was strange. If Polynesians descended in a straight line from Taiwan, both the maternal and paternal DNA should tell the same story. Instead, mothers were saying Asia and fathers were saying Melanesia in disproportionate numbers. Scientists eventually worked out what this meant, and it forced a rewrite of the story that had seemed settled just a few years earlier. Instead of a fast, direct migration straight from Taiwan out into the open Pacific, sometimes called the express train model, a different picture emerged nicknamed the slow boat model. In this version, the ancestors of Polynesians did begin their journey in Asia, exactly as the mitochondrial DNA and the languages suggested. But on the way, as they moved through the islands near New Guinea, they did not sail straight past the people already living there. They stopped, they interacted, and in many cases, local Melanesian men joined. These expanding populations, likely because of the way society was organized in these early voyaging groups, where women moving in from the ancestral Asian population brought their maternal lineages forward, while local men were absorbed into the group and became fathers within it. The result, generations later, is a Polynesian population whose mother's line traces cleanly back to Asia, while a meaningful portion of their father's line traces back to Melanesia. It is a genetic fingerprint of a journey that was not one clean migration, but a long, complicated, generations-long process of movement, contact, and mixing across thousands of miles of islands. This alone should have been a significant enough discovery to reshape how people understood Polynesian history. The truth was not the simple story either side had been telling. It was not a pure Asian migration, untouched by contact, and it was certainly not a South American origin story either. It was something messier, slower, and in many ways more human, a long relay of contact and intermarriage, stretching across centuries and thousands of miles of ocean. But the deepest twist in this story was still waiting to be found, and it came from a completely different kind of study, one that finally answered the question Heyerdahl had spent his whole life trying to prove, just from the opposite direction than he expected. In 2020, a team of researchers led by scientists from Stanford University set out to answer a very specific question using the most advanced genetic tools available. They wanted to know whether there was any genuine evidence of contact between Polynesians and Native Americans buried somewhere in living human DNA. This had been debated for decades because of one stubborn clue that refused to go away: the sweet potato. The sweet potato is a crop native to South America. And yet, somehow, it had been growing in Polynesia for centuries before European contact, showing up in the earliest written and oral records across islands separated by thousands of miles of ocean from where the plant originally evolved. For decades, scientists argued about how it got there. Did the plant simply float across the ocean on its own, carried by currents, and take root without any human help at all? Or did someone carry it there deliberately, meaning that people from the Americas and people from Polynesia had been in direct contact centuries before Columbus ever left Europe? The Stanford-led team collected genetic samples from more than 800 people, drawing from 17 Polynesian island populations and 15 indigenous groups spread along the Pacific coast of the Americas, all the way from Mexico down through Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Chile. Using techniques that can identify segments of DNA that are identical by descent, meaning stretches of genetic code so similar between two people that they almost certainly inherited them from the very same shared ancestor within a relatively recent number of generations. They searched for any sign that these two populations had actually met, and they found it. Clear, unmistakable, statistically overwhelming evidence. People living today on Rapa Nui, on the Marquesas Islands and the Mangareva Islands, and elsewhere across eastern Polynesia carry segments of DNA that come directly from Native American ancestors. This was not some faint, ancient, distantly shared signal buried so deep in the genome that it could be explained away as coincidence or shared deep ancestry from tens of thousands of years ago when humans first spread out of Africa. This was recent, specific, and traceable. It was the genetic signature of real people meeting, real contact, and children being born from that contact, whose descendants are alive on those islands right now. Even more remarkable, the researchers were able to pin down roughly when this contact happened using the length and pattern of these shared DNA segments, since genetic material breaks down into shorter pieces at a predictable rate with each new generation. Their estimate placed the moment of contact at around the year 1150, give or take a few decades. That date is worth sitting with for a moment. The year 1150 is roughly 340 years before Christopher Columbus ever set sail across the Atlantic. It is centuries before any European ship reached the Pacific. It is an era when much of Europe was still deep in the medieval period, when the great cathedrals of the Gothic age were just beginning to rise, and when almost nobody in the recorded history of the so-called Old World had any concept that the Pacific Ocean, let alone the civilizations on either side of it, even existed. And here is where the story turns Heyerdahl's entire theory completely upside down. His idea was that ancient South Americans sailed west and became the ancestors of the Polynesians, explaining Polynesian culture as fundamentally rooted in an American origin. The DNA tells the opposite direction of story. The genetic signal shows Native American ancestry arriving into an already established Polynesian population, one that had already been settling and spreading across the Pacific for centuries by the time this contact occurred. In other words, it wasn't South Americans sailing out into the Pacific and becoming Polynesians. It was Polynesians, master voyagers who had already conquered thousands of miles of open ocean using stars, waves, and the flight patterns of birds, who very likely reached the coast of the Americas themselves, made contact, and then carried some of that ancestry back with them into the heart of Polynesia. This detail matters enormously, and it is worth explaining clearly. When researchers looked at exactly which indigenous American population this ancient DNA most closely matched, the answer pointed specifically toward the Pacific coast of what is now Colombia, closely resembling the genetic profile of a group known today as the Xenu people. This is not a random detail. It suggests that the contact event likely did not happen out in the middle of the ocean by pure chance, nor did it happen along the coast of Peru where Heyerdahl launched his famous raft. It points toward the Colombian coastline as the most probable site, where two extraordinary seafaring traditions, one built around ocean-going canoes crossing the vast emptiness of the Pacific, and one rooted in coastal and riverine travel along the northern edge of South America, briefly intersected. Picture what that moment likely looked like. A double-hulled Polynesian voyaging canoe, the kind capable of carrying dozens of people along with food, water, and livestock across thousands of miles of open ocean, using nothing but the stars, the patterns of ocean swells, and the flight paths of seabirds for navigation, arriving somewhere along an unfamiliar coastline. And on that shore, people whose entire understanding of the world, whose language, whose gods, whose sense of geography had never included any concept of the place these visitors had come from. Two branches of humanity that had been separated for tens of thousands of years since their ancestors walked out of different corners of the world entirely, meeting face to face for what may have been the first time in human history that people from these two branches ever stood in the same place. We do not know exactly how long this contact lasted. We do not know if it was one meeting or several. We do not know whether it was friendly, tense, or something in between. But we know it happened because the evidence for it is written directly into the genome of people living today more than 800 years later. This single discovery answered the sweet potato mystery as well, or at least made the most likely explanation far clearer. If Polynesian voyagers really did reach the coast of South America, carrying that same extraordinary navigational skill that let them find and settle islands as remote and tiny as specks in an ocean covering a third of the planet, then bringing sweet potato tubers back with them on the return journey is not a stretch at all. It becomes, in fact, the far more plausible explanation than a crop drifting across 4,000 miles of open ocean current entirely on its own and somehow taking root in a form healthy enough to be cultivated for centuries afterward. So the real story, the one written into DNA rather than sold in a best-selling adventure book, reverses almost everything Heyerdahl claimed, while still honoring the one thing he actually did prove, which is that this crossing was physically possible. He was right that the ocean was not an impassable wall. He was wrong about who crossed it, and in which direction, and for what reason. It was not South Americans becoming the ancestors of the Polynesian people. It was Polynesians, already the product of a much older and more complicated migration story rooted in Asia and Melanesia, who eventually pushed their voyaging skills so far that they reached the shores of an entirely different continent, made contact with people living there, and returned home carrying both a crop and a small thread of new ancestry that their descendants still carry today. Once scientists had this discovery in hand, the next question naturally followed. If Polynesians were confident and skilled enough to reach South America, when exactly did they spread across the rest of the Pacific? And in what order did they settle island after island across that vast expanse of ocean? A separate but related genetic study drawing DNA samples from 430 modern individuals spread across 21 different Pacific Island populations, set out to answer exactly that question by tracking subtle genetic signatures, essentially rare variations in DNA that appear and then either fade out or spread further, depending on how small the founding population of an island actually was when people first arrived there. The picture that emerged from this data was stunningly precise. The expansion into remote eastern Polynesia appears to have begun in Samoa, spreading outward from there. Voyagers reached Rarotonga in the Cook Islands by around the year 830. From there, the expansion continued eastward and reached the Society Islands, home to Tahiti, by around the 11th century. Voyagers then pushed further to the Austral Islands and the Tuamotu archipelago sometime around the 12th century. And from that string of small islands scattered across the Tuamotus, later generations launched voyages that stretched astonishing distances, eventually settling islands as far apart as Rapa Nui, thousands of miles to the east, and other islands curving back westward, such as Raivave. What makes this settlement pattern even more remarkable is how quickly it all happened. Based on the genetic evidence, the entire span of eastern Polynesian settlement, from the first voyagers leaving Samoa to the arrival of people on the most remote islands at the eastern edge of the Polynesian Triangle, appears to have taken place within roughly 500 years. 500 years to find, settle, and establish stable populations on tiny islands scattered across an ocean covering more surface area than every landmass on Earth combined. There was no satellite navigation. There were no metal tools, no written charts, no compasses. There was simply an extraordinarily refined body of accumulated knowledge passed down through generations of navigators who could read the subtle differences between ocean swells reflecting off distant islands, who could recognize specific stars rising at precise points on the horizon depending on the season, and who could track the flight patterns of land-nesting birds heading out to sea each morning and returning each evening, using them as living compasses pointing back toward solid ground. There is one more thread in this story worth pulling on, because it ties directly back to some of the most famous and mysterious objects to ever come out of Polynesia, the enormous stone statues carved on multiple islands, scattered across a huge portion of the eastern Pacific, most famously the Moai of Rapa Nui, but also similar carving traditions found on other islands separated from Rapa Nui by thousands of miles of ocean. For a long time, one open question loomed over these statues. Did this specific artistic and cultural tradition of carving enormous stone monuments develop independently over and over on separate islands that had little to no contact with each other? Or did it originate once in a single place and spread outward as people carried both their genes and their culture with them? The genetic data appears to answer that question as well, and the answer is startling in its precision. Tracing shared Polynesian ancestry between the populations of these different statue-carving islands points to a single common point of origin, and that point appears to be the Tuamotu Islands, the very same cluster of small remote islands that served as the launching point for the extraordinary long-distance voyages that reached both Rapa Nui and, quite possibly, the coast of South America itself. According to this reconstruction, settlers reached the island of Mataiva in the northern Tuamotus, sometime around the year 1110. From there, or from nearby islands in the same archipelago, groups of voyagers who shared this common ancestry pushed outward in different directions, some traveling far to the east and eventually reaching Rapa Nui, others eventually curving back westward toward islands such as Raivave, carrying with them not just their genes, but very likely the artistic tradition and cultural practice of carving massive stone figures. That timeline overlaps almost precisely with the era in which the DNA evidence places the contact between Polynesians and South Americans. This raises a genuinely fascinating possibility that some researchers have begun exploring. The idea that the same generation, or nearly the same generation, of highly skilled Tuamotuan voyagers may have been responsible both for reaching the shores of South America and for spreading the stone carving tradition that would eventually produce some of the most recognizable and mysterious monuments in human history. It remains a provocative hypothesis rather than settled fact. But it is exactly the kind of connection that only becomes visible once you have DNA capable of tracing these threads across centuries and thousands of miles of open water. Step back now and look at the full shape of this story. For most of the 20th century, the dominant public narrative about the origins of the Polynesian people came from one man, one raft, and one dramatic 101-day voyage across the Pacific. It was a compelling story, filmed, published, celebrated with an Academy Award, and repeated in classrooms for generations. And it was fundamentally backward. The people of Polynesia were not the descendants of South Americans who drifted west on rafts. Their deepest roots trace back to Taiwan and Southeast Asia, carried by the same great wave of human expansion that produced the entire Austronesian language family, stretching from Madagascar to Easter Island. Along the way, through the islands near New Guinea, their ancestors mixed extensively with Melanesian populations, creating the distinctive genetic signature, split between maternal and paternal lineages, that scientists uncovered decades later. And then, centuries after settling the vast majority of the Pacific, these same descendants, using nothing but wooden canoes and an unmatched mastery of natural navigation, sailed all the way to the shores of South America itself, made contact with people living along the Colombian coast, and returned home carrying both a new crop and a small permanent thread of Native American ancestry that survives in their descendants to this day. The direction of the entire story runs the opposite way from what made Heyerdahl famous. It was not South America populating the Pacific. It was the Pacific reaching out and touching South America, a feat of exploration and endurance that, if anything, is even more extraordinary than the one Heyerdahl set out to prove, because it did not require a raft drifting passively at the mercy of ocean currents. It required deliberate, skilled, repeatable long-distance voyaging, navigation precise enough to find tiny islands scattered across an ocean covering a third of the entire surface of planet Earth, and then, remarkably, precise enough to make that journey both outward to a completely unknown continent and back home again, carrying knowledge, crops, and lineage with them. It is worth pausing on just how demanding that navigational system actually was, because it is easy to hear the word wayfinding and imagine something vague or intuitive when in reality it was one of the most rigorous intellectual traditions ever developed by any human society. Master navigators trained for years, sometimes decades, memorizing what is often called a star compass, a mental map dividing the horizon into dozens of precise points, each one marked by the rising or setting position of a specific star at a specific time of year. A navigator lying in the hull of a canoe at night could track the ship's heading purely by watching which star sat on the horizon at a given moment, correcting course as that star rose too high to be useful and handing off guidance to the next star in the sequence. During the day, with no stars visible, the same navigators read the ocean itself, feeling for subtle patterns in the swell that revealed the presence of land far beyond the horizon, since islands bend and reflect ocean swells in specific, learnable ways long before any coastline becomes visible to the eye. They watched the color of the sky reflecting off shallow lagoons from many miles away. They tracked cloud formations that tend to build up over islands, and they studied the behavior of specific seabird species known to nest on land but forage far out at sea each day, using the direction those birds flew each morning and evening as a living signpost pointing toward solid ground. None of this was guesswork, and none of it was luck. It was a precise, tested, generationally refined body of knowledge, verified constantly against real outcomes, because a serious navigational mistake meant death for an entire crew. For much of the 20th century, this tradition was dismissed by many outside observers as romantic folklore rather than genuine science, an attitude that made theories like Heyerdahl's, involving a raft drifting at the mercy of currents, feel more plausible than the idea that Pacific Islanders had mastered deliberate, controlled ocean travel on their own terms. The DNA evidence closes that gap for good, confirming that this navigational tradition was real and powerful enough to carry people across the entire width of the Pacific Ocean and back again. Thor Heyerdahl was not lying, and he was not a fraud. He genuinely believed his theory, and he was brave enough and skilled enough to attempt something almost nobody else was willing to try. But being able to prove that a voyage was physically possible is not the same thing as proving that it actually happened, and it is certainly not the same thing as proving who made it and in which direction. Decades after his raft crashed onto a reef in French Polynesia, the true answer was sitting quietly inside the cells of the very descendants he claimed to explain, waiting for the tools capable of reading it. When those tools finally arrived, they told a story of navigation, endurance, and connection across an ocean so vast it is difficult to comprehend. A story far stranger, more intricate, and ultimately far more impressive than the one that made Heyerdahl a legend in the first place.